Hi there, my name's John Hill and I'm Head of Content at Picklejar Communications. Now, I know most of you are aware of podcasts, and quite a few of you have probably tried having a go at doing them yourselves. But have you ever tried creating audio stories like you hear on the radio? Today, we're going to go a little bit further than just switching the mic on and off, and we're going to be talking about how you can use your interviews to create compelling and interesting audio stories using sound, script, story, and music. And we're going to do it with a little bit of a twist. Here's how Tom Burns got one of his favourite holiday photos. It happened one night in the Bahamas. Tom was in his diving gear, perched on the seabed with a dive partner. That's when he spotted something he'd been looking for years.
We could see some great hammerheads on the peripheral, but they wouldn't come in close. So we decided to turn off our lights and just sit on the bottom very quietly and see if the sharks would come closer.
Tom's camera was on the sand beside him, his strobe lights ready to go. And next to that, a crate of fish for bait. Tom knew it was working because he could see inky black eyes in the moonlight closing in.
The eyes, they sort of have a reflection and they're like a cat at night. I could tell it was quite a large shark. I could tell it was getting bolder and bolder.
He grabbed his kit and waited. And with the shark just a few feet from his face, he took the shot. So that was my first audio story. Now, don't get me wrong, I've been doing storytelling for years. When I was a really little kid, I would spend all of my time wandering around, like doing little short stories and poems and scripts whenever I got the chance. And then I discovered this new thing called blogging, and I got started on that as well. And then I became a journalist, and that gave me a chance to talk to all sorts of different people. People in sport, people in music, people in finance, people telling really cool and interesting human stories that I could tell and make a difference. But one of the things I was really into from being a very, very young boy was audio. Because I remember sitting around and watching the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy radio plays and being astounded that all this really interesting atmosphere and fantasy and world building could just appear out of this little soundstage at the BBC with a microphone. So when I was coming to the end of my time in journalism, I'd be wandering around to events with my phone and a little microphone end stuck over the top of it. And I would be talking to all of these people at these events and finding out what they were doing and finding out more about what they were speaking about. And it was exciting and interesting. But it wasn't enough, because it wasn't quite that storytelling that I remembered from listening to all these radio plays as a kid. So when I got the opportunity, I packed everything up and I went to Cape Cod and I learned audio journalism and audio storytelling from the people at Transom. That meant I was talking to people from really amazing American podcasts, people who were working on NPR every day, people who were working on shows like This American Life, Planet Money, Code Switch, How Sound. And that was great. But here's the thing. I'm not necessarily a natural candidate to do journalism. Sure, I'm really interested in writing, and I could write all day if I was given the chance. But I'm a bit of an anxious person as well. I'm a bit introverted and I struggle to get myself motivated to talk to people and be in the same room with people, much less interview them. So what my anxiety is telling me now is that I'm probably not the person to teach you how to make audio stories. But in a way, that means I'm exactly the right person, because I know what it's like to feel like you want to try something new, but you're worried that you won't do so well, or to be carrying on with something when every fiber in your being is telling you to stop. So today we're going to have a bit of a chat about how to take your audio from a basic interview to something with all sorts of different features in it and make it feel like real storytelling. But we're also going to play whack-a-mole with that pesky little voice in your head that's telling you to stop and that you're not good enough. So let's go. So I've been banging on about audio stories for about 2 to 3 minutes now, so it's probably about time I describe what they actually are. Now, As opposed to, say, for example, a podcast interview where you switch on your microphone, you talk to somebody in the studio or on the internet, and that conversation might be free flowing and unedited and go on for anything from half an hour to an hour and a half. An audio story is slightly more scripted and slightly more dramatic. Now, it might take you to different places with different sound effects and different sound design. It might introduce you to different people. It might include a narrator to help you along the way, or it may not. Audio stories are more based around storytelling than discussion and chat. So they're shorter, they're more story-driven, they're more dramatic, but they're also more work. So, hold on to your hats. But the first thing that you need to think about is what kit you need. And at this point, your anxiety is probably working overdrive, and I know mine is, because I'm the sort of person that randomly goes around spending £400 on a piece of kit because you think the next piece of kit that you buy is the one that's going to help you to do your work properly. It's going to open a creative dimension that you hadn't possibly been aware of. And in that sense, your anxiety is helping you to procrastinate because you don't need as much kit as you think to start doing audio storytelling. What you essentially need to do audio storytelling is this. You need a pair of headphones. You need an audio recorder of some description. This is a little bit more on the expensive side, but you can get a lot cheaper ones. That thing that just fell on the floor is your microphone, which is extremely important for picking things up. You will, of course, need a cable of some description to connect this and this. You will need some audio editing software as well, so that when you put all this stuff together, you're going to be able to actually get something interesting out of it and clip all this stuff together. But if you're feeling really, really picky and you feel like you don't necessarily want to spend all this money, all you need to do is get a phone with a microphone cover, maybe that you buy from an electronics store for no money at all. And phones are amazing things because they're going to allow you to pick up all this audio and do your basic stuff until you're ready to take yourself to the next level. So here's where it all starts. Finding your idea for an audio story. Because, of course, the idea is how the story grows, because the idea is how you think about who you can find, who you can talk to, what interesting scenes you have, what interesting obstacles those people that you meet overcome. But it has to start from you finding the thing that is worth telling or worth you pursuing. So what makes a decent story? There is by no means one right way to talk about what makes a decent story, but some of the things that do go into it, it's got to be gripping. It's got to have movement. It's got to move itself along and have momentum. It's got to be something unusual. Some people say it's got to be something where the main character maybe changes or learns something or grows throughout, or that we discover something. It's got to be human at its heart. And in the case of audio storytelling, it's got to be suitable for audio, because there's no good with having an absolutely amazing visual experience if you don't have any visuals. So at this point, when I was looking for audio stories, my anxiety was running into overdrive at this point, because I was thinking, at this point, I was probably 10 to 15 years into a journalism career, and trying to do something like this, I felt like that experience should give me a shortcut to try and find an amazing story that would sound absolutely brilliant on audio. And the truth is that a lot of the time, there is no shortcut for journalists, because you get one story, it doesn't mean that you continue to get them forever, just that you have a better sense of what makes a story, or maybe a better sense of where you want to go to find the stories that you really like. So there's not really an easy way around that, but there is a formula that I found very interesting and useful to help you to work out if a story is worth you telling once you've found it. And this was something that was shared by Planet Money and Gimlet CEO Alex Blumberg. And Alex Blumberg said that one great way to pitch is to say, I'm doing a story on X, and it's interesting because Y. Now, what that does is it encourages you to think beyond just this situation in itself is unusual. So, say, for example, you're interviewing a fireman, and you might think, well, that fireman must lead a very exciting life. But that's not necessarily an unusual thing. It's not necessarily a story worth telling, because you don't necessarily know if there's anything special about this fireman, if there's anything where this fireman has gone on a particular journey, or if there's something different about them that makes it a story worth telling to people who have met firemen or who are firemen. One alternative thing is to say, like, okay, what is there about this person that is confounding, interesting, or unusual? So say, for example, I'm going to do a story on a pilot, and it's an interesting story because she's afraid of heights. Now, that takes the natural story about a pilot, which is in itself quite interesting, but then you want to find out more about how did this pilot become a pilot if she was scared of heights? Why would she go into that particular profession? Is there anything that has happened to her that has made her feel better or worse about that situation? And how has that particular fear dictated what she's done in her career? Another particularly interesting thing is I was working with a guy over in America, and he had a story that he wanted to do. And he wanted to do a story on a birder, someone who wanders around and identifies different birds and follows them around and finds their calls. And that was interesting for him, not because birders were unusual, there are birders everywhere, but because that birder was 15 years old, and because that birder actually felt like he was trapped on this island hometown of his. And part of the melancholy and the pathos of this whole thing was that he was seeing all these birds fly away, and he didn't feel like he was going to leave or do anything. So I'll give you an example of a few of the rejected stories when we were tasked with doing audio stories at this place. One of the ways I tried to pitch, the first one I pitched was, I'm going to do a story on death cafes. Now, death cafes started off in London about 10 years ago or so, and they were weekly meetings for people to come and have a coffee and discuss the concept of death, and to take away some of the sting and stigma that comes from discussing that. And I thought that was really fascinating. But the problem with that was that I didn't really see how I could make it different. There had been meetings all over the world. What was specifically interesting about this one place that I was going to? That would have relied on me finding someone who was absolutely fascinating and having that person take that story off their own weight. It wasn't a story that could carry itself on its own. Equally, there was a story I wanted to do on a study of suburban yards. So there was a research project that was studying all the areas, flora and fauna and ecology that was taking place in suburban American yards. And I thought that would be a fascinating story. But the problem was that wasn't particularly audio friendly. Now, grass does make a noise, but it's not the most vocal of things. And a lot of that would have probably just involved talking to a lot of people or reciting research. So again, not particularly useful for me. And then another one I wanted to do was a story about marijuana being decriminalized, because that was happening all around Cape Cod at the time that I was there. And the problem I had with that was, although that was interesting and fascinating to me as a person in Britain where this has not yet happened, the issue I had was that was happening everywhere in the place where I was. So again, I was going to have to try and find something different in a piece of legislation that was taking place everywhere. Again, it was relying on me finding somebody in the street or finding someone in that meeting that would have something interesting to say. And that wasn't a story in its own right. That was a place to maybe try and find one. So the first story that I did was a story about a shark photographer. And the thing I found interesting about that shark photographer was that he was actually employed full-time as a vet for small animals like little bunny rabbits. And I found that particularly fascinating. Like a guy who would wander down to the bottom of the ocean, sit there without a cage with a bucket full of fish. And his day job was to be the kindly Dr. Tom who looked after little bunny rabbits and actually seemed like a very good-natured and quiet man. And I wanted to explore that. Now, is that a good story in itself? No, it's probably more of a human interest piece because you didn't necessarily see much growth or much development. But one of the things that you probably think about is, can you are you going to benefit from doing this story yourself? Do you enjoy doing this story yourself? And one of the stories I started finding was I really wanted to go and interview some people in a community. And I wanted to interview people about their lives. And I wanted to just chat to someone about things that brought them together at that time, which led me to this story.
Barbara Adamson and Florence Delaney are sisters. They shared a room growing up, and they're still close. You'll often find them here, smoking in Barbara's Chevy Blazer.
There's another one that just popped up. Where?
Their morning starts at Betsy's Diner in Falmouth. They order breakfast and plan the day.
No, it's this one.
Then they're in the car with a thermos of tea.
That's Bud Stop or the church? That's Bud Stop. Bud Stop and the church have one. I got Bud Stop. And the church.
They're constantly checking their phones.
What church?
And when something pops up,
It's got 52 minutes?
it's time to get moving.
But this is what we do.
And what they do is hunt Pokemon.
So if there's one piece of advice that comes out of all of this, is that, again, that story, is that a particularly dynamic and dramatic story? It's fun and it's interesting. And we're talking about two sisters who rediscovered each other almost, like, and rediscovered like going out every day and hanging out together through a shared love of Pokemon Go at a time when their grandchildren and their kids had completely and utterly just left it alone. And the one thing that struck me about doing all this was that I realized that when you're doing something like audio storytelling, you don't have to be an undiscovered genius when you're starting out. That we stop doing something just because we're worried that we're not going to excel at it, we're not going to be amazing at it, and that we're not going to appear from the first time that we pick up a microphone, that there's a latent talent and we just discover we're the chosen one. And sometimes saying that you're going to go out there and create the greatest story ever isn't a task, it's a stick that you use to beat yourself with, because there'll never be a story that's good enough for you if you're looking for perfection. Instead, the sort of thing that maybe you could be looking for is an opportunity to do a story that helps you explore what you love, or practice skills that you want to learn, or meet different types of people, or maybe learn something. So that's where I started. So say you found your subject and you found your idea, you found the thing you want to spend your time on, and maybe you found some people you want to talk to about it. Maybe you've gone on Facebook, or you've gone on Twitter, or you've trawled through your contacts book, or wandered around and maybe met people in person, possibly not now, but and you've got that interview subject, and now your anxiety is buzzing a little bit over time because you've got this one person, you've got them on side, they're going to spend some time talking to you, and you're worried, what if I mess up this interview? What if the interview itself isn't particularly interesting? And one way to start dealing with that anxiety is to start planning your story now. So it seems counterintuitive. You haven't even interviewed the person yet, and you're already thinking about what's going to be in the story. Surely that sounds weird and it's wrong. But no, you don't have to be completely tethered to what you decide in this story, and the person can confound and surprise and interest you and can take you in all sorts of different directions. But start thinking about what you naturally expect the story to do and what you need that interviewer to provide for you in order for you to get this story to move along. So what I'm talking about is maybe brainstorming some questions. So you've got this person here, say, for example, you've got the shark photographer who's the small veterinarian, and you're thinking, what do I need to tell this story? What do I need to know about them? Maybe you might find out, like, why did he discover sharks? Why did he got really interested in sharks? Maybe ask him to tell a story about like what the most interesting shark experience he'd had. And start thinking about all the different things that you need to make this story happen. And when you get them in a room, you've got to start trying to get all of that detail out of them. And the way to do that is to start asking them open questions. You don't want to start painting someone into a corner by asking them questions to which the answer is just yes or no. That's awful audio. So ask them loads of open questions. Questions like, What happened next? Tell me about this experience. Tell me a story about your most interesting shark dive. Ask them to describe what's happened. Ask them to describe conversations and what people are saying. Ask them to describe their surroundings, because they're going to need the audio to describe what's happening in the room. And remember, ask them what happened next and what happened next and what happened next. And don't cut them off when they're about to say something exciting. And remember, when you're brainstorming these questions, remember to ask that crucial question that you need in order to make that story work. Because you don't want to be walking away and working out, oh, I should have asked that question. That whole story doesn't go together if it's like you don't ask the killer question, like, were you ever scared? Like, why do you do that? And then get them to answer that in an interesting way. Now, there are certain things that you need to be aware of when you're doing an interview for audio. The first thing you're thinking about is maybe, are you interviewing somebody in place, like in a coffee shop, to create ambience? Are you looking for any background noise at all, or are you looking to interview them in the quiet? Now, ambient noise is really good if you're trying to create a scene where somebody's in a certain place. But say, for example, you want to use this interview later on and you want the background to be completely quiet, or you want to put them in a different scene, depending on how ethical or unethical you feel that is. You need to then be able to have some audio that doesn't have the background noise on it so that you can move them around. And to do that, you need to make everything really quiet. So you need to be switching off the air conditioning units. You need to be switching off the fans. You need to get the noisy dog out of the room. You need to find a room that's as quiet as possible so the car noise isn't going back and forth. And you need to switch your phone onto airplane mode so that you're not making that bzz, 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 bzz noise when somebody gets a message. Now, there are lots of different ways to conduct an interview. One of them is the very basic one. It's this sort of thing. It's going up to somebody. And when you're interviewing somebody in the field, what you need to do is you need to keep your microphone pretty close to their mouth. You'll be surprised how close you need to get. Don't make them eat it, but get that microphone quite close so that it can pick up at the right level. You're also, if you're trying to record remotely, and a lot of us will be trying to record remotely at the minute, and one of the things you can do for that, you can use things like Zoom, you can record a Zoom call, you can use tools like Zencastr to record remotely. But sometimes if you're recording remotely, you're recording the audio that's coming over the internet towards you, and that can sound extremely muffly, and it can't sound particularly good unless you're trying to get that you're talking to someone on the phone effect. And one way that we got around this is I was shared this trip by somebody who worked at Canada Land, and they would say what you should do is you should phone somebody up on Zoom or on Skype or whatever, and you should get them to be on the other end of the phone talking to you on their computer. But while they're talking to you on their computer, they have their hand with their phone pressed against their ear with an audio memos app on their phone. And while they're talking, they're recording the audio onto that app on their phone. And when they're done, they just Dropbox it over to you or send it over to you by email. And you have that audio that sounds like it's recorded in the room, because it is. So if you're thinking about something like that, that's actually a really nice tip for getting quality audio that doesn't sound like it's been squeezed down an electronic pipe. So you've got your interviews together and you've got a really interesting sense now of how this is developing. But like we said before, if you wanted to do an hour and a half interview with one person, you would do a podcast interview, right? And that would be brilliant and amazing. But you're looking to do something slightly different with an audio story. So what you're going to have to start doing now is start building a story that maybe involves the passage of time or different scenes or different people and different ways to build up an interesting narrative. And that means that you're trying to create lots of different phases in your story. Now, everyone who is really into songwriting has this sense of movement with their song. So the progressions and arrangement of a song. So you've got your intro. Maybe your first verse is quite light and quite calm, and it builds up to this big chorus. And then the chorus drops again and it goes into your second verse, which might be the same or maybe slightly different with tension. It goes into the second verse. You have this middle eight, and then you build up to this big crescendo, maybe with the last verse. And all of that has this kind of movement and energy as you kind of like drift along that scale. And your audio story should do something very similar. Now, this is where my anxiety really starts kicking in again, because what you've got here is this thing where you're being asked to be endlessly inventive on a theme. Now, you might just have one little riff that you want to do. And when I was songwriting, I used to get really, really nervous about this thing I would call the Bohemian Rhapsody problem. Bismillah, we will not let you go. Let me go. We'll not let you go. Let me go. We'll not let you go. Let me go. And the Bohemian Rhapsody problem was that you've got all of these amazing little scenes in Bohemian Rhapsody. It's going effortlessly moving from one bit to another bit, and everything is different. There's so many ideas. And my anxiety is now telling me you can't possibly be this inventive. You don't have this many ideas. You're not creative enough to do any of this. So one of the things I found really interesting when I was learning to do audio journalism and audio stories at Transom was that they were telling me about the concept which is called scenes. So a scene will be something that you might have noticed from, like, if you've ever done any movie scripts or anything like this. And a scene is basically putting down on paper little blocks, little acts in which certain things happen. So it might start up with scene one, might be the idea. That's the encapsulating idea behind this particular scene. Which characters are going to be involved with it? Where is it going to be set? And where is it going to be set will determine whether it's kind of just like a regular interview with quiet background, or whether you're going to need to interview them in a field or something like this. For example, this scene here that we showed earlier was the scene of Barbara and Florence. They're in a Chevy, it's a battered Chevy with an air conditioning unit in the back, and they've got their iPads and they're wandering around Cape Cod hunting Pokemon. And so that scene would involve audio on the scene of me in the back seat of this car recording all this stuff with the background noise of the car and the other cars driving past and things like this. And it will be slow because it's introducing a concept. Then you maybe go on to the second scene, and the second scene would be to be more explanation about what Pokemon Go is for people who aren't doing it. You can maybe have a little bit more fun with that. You can start using music and sound effects, and that can be slightly more jolly because it's a scene that's not really located anywhere. It's more narrated. It's more of a sort of like fourth wall thing where you're just talking to your audience and you're not particularly anywhere. And so you can get really exciting with that, and you can bounce that about. And because it's a different scene, the pace can be different. And then you've got that sense of movement where you're introducing your audience to something different and keeping their interest, because we know that people's interest levels are really low at the minute, and you need to give them something, otherwise they're going to go away. And the most important thing is, when you're doing something like this, to play around and have fun. I was introduced to the concept of the Songwriting Lodge a few years ago, and that was the idea that somebody who was particularly worried about overthinking and being a perfectionist with their music, they would wake up at 8 o'clock in the morning, and they'd challenge their friends to do this as well. They'd wake up at 8 o'clock in the morning, and their job would be to write 20 songs or as close to 20 songs before they got to 6 or 7 o'clock. And they'd be just charging through this. And at the end, they would record everything, and they would go round to their friend's house, and they would have a drink, and they would play their music for each other. And what that was designed to do was to get rid of that sense where everyone was overthinking everything they do, because you do not have time to overthink when you're writing 20 songs in about 8 hours. So when you're doing something like that, it just encourages you to be silly and to think less and just to play around. And as we say, have fun. So next stage, you've got your interviews down, you've plotted out your scenes, you've got a pretty good sense of where this story is going. And now it comes to the granular bit. And that bit is writing your script. Now, at this point, you're taking all of the stuff that you've learned from all of your interviews and you're sifting them. You're going through, you're transcribing your work, and you're picking out all the bits in your interviews to find the real gold. And the real gold is stuff that's, what's surprising in all the interviews that you've done? What's funny in all the interviews that you've done? Is there a moment that feels really human? Is there moment that feels really interesting, like really factual, or gives you something you don't know? Is there a moment that in which one of the characters maybe reveals something about themselves that was previously hidden, or reveals something about someone else, or an issue that was previously hidden? Is there something, because remember, we are talking about a time limit here, is there something in which someone has encapsulated something in a snappy way? Because you do not have time to put 2 minutes of audio directly down into your story and just let that run, because it kind of gets to a point eventually. You're going to have to be a little bit snappier here. And the stuff that doesn't have that in, you're going to have to learn to kill the rest. Now, when I was doing my story with the Pokemon Go players back in the day, I remember I was having a really interesting conversation with them, and they were talking about how their children and their grandchildren used to play the game, but they didn't anymore. And then they would go into this big, long chat about how that was to do with the lack of motivation among young people these days. And I found it was quite funny and it was quite quaint, but it didn't really move the story on. It didn't really say a great deal that other bits hadn't said. It didn't feel snappy, so it had to go. And when you're writing your script, remember, you're writing a script that is for an audio show, so there's no bailing you out if you don't say something or present something that the listener can't hear. So describe things so that your listener can see. By which I mean, if you're introducing someone to a scene, your ambient sound or your background noise can only do some of the work. Maybe your narrator starts talking about, well, who is this person? Where is this person? What's the environment around them? What time of day it is? What other information is valuable right now for your audience to get into that moment? And maybe that person has said it themselves. Maybe the interviewee has given you really valuable audio that you can use to express that environment. But otherwise, you're going to have to do it yourself as a narrator. And your anxiety is at this point, or my anxiety is at this point, going, oh no, my God, this is going to be long and ponderous and boring. And I'll talk a little bit about, as a writer, how I struggled. I struggled as a writer to convert myself to audio, because I would write in a very different way to how I would speak. So my first stab at this Pokemon Go script was very descriptive. It was very ornate writing. We see here, like, it's Barbara and Florence have been close since childhood, and they've been growing up in Falmouth as the younger of 5. They make time for each other between work and their kids and grandkids. And this is all very descriptive, but it's descriptive in a way that feels written. It doesn't feel like it's a spoken thing that you would tell to a friend or something. It doesn't feel like it was part of the story that you would communicate via speech. And that next bit, of course, you see they would be talking about, oh, we were going to the malls, but it would be getting too pricey. I don't understand how that's really particularly relevant. And the next bit where we're talking about, oh, the preparations for the day. Oh, she's making me the tea, and then we set off and we did this. This is too much information. This is not going anywhere very quickly. So we move on to step 2. We move on to the second bit of this, which is me being a little bit more about how they feel about their children and their grandchildren, and they spent the day driving around being out with people. And you see we're going into a big old diatribe here about the younger generation. They don't have the time. They're too lazy to go out, in my opinion. It's more laziness. And not my son's part. He worked and stuff like this. And it's interesting, but it's not part of the story. It's more of a regular conversation, and it feels superfluous to what we're trying to do. So what I ended up with is this third draft here, or it may have been more than 3 drafts at this point, but we started being very punchy sentences. You see here all these sentences of very few words. Barbara Adamson and Florence Delalia, sisters. That's pretty much the smallest amount of words that you can say that fact in. They shared a room growing up and they're still close. You'll often find them here smoking in Barbara's Chevy Blazer. And here we are, we've set the scene, we're in the Chevy Blazer, and then we're bringing them in. They're now doing their talking, and we can hear the background noise, and we're in the moment. And it feels a lot more urgent and maybe a little bit more, a little bit more like we're telling a pacey story rather than waffling.
Sorry. And if they win, they each get to add it to their collection. But only if they can flick a ball at it to trap it.
Flick a what?
A ball.
Like a bull, like a horned bull?
Ball, B-A-L-L.
Oh, ball.
I need to be more explicit with ball.
Yeah, you said
Okay.
It sounded like a bull.
Yeah. If they win, they each get to add it to their collection.
So I suppose one of the things that I really struggled with when I was first starting to learn how to be a narrator, and you're probably going to have to put narration in your audio story for the time being, unless you're starting to get really advanced with non-narrative storytelling and having like the interviewee tell the entire thing around sound. And a lot of people start off and they want to do that, but it's quite tricky to do because you need that exposition. You need somebody to be there to go, and then this happened, and then this happened, and to link the various scenes and bits of the story together. It can be very tricky not to do that. And one of the things I struggled with most when I was doing my narrating was that I was trying to be the people that I used to hear when I was listening to the radio. And everyone in America who does audio storytelling and audio, they all turn up speaking like Ira Glass.
Freddie is the general manager of a car dealership these days, but he used to be a car salesman, and he was a good one. Partly because he's got what he calls the gift for the gab.
And for me, it was all thinking about the BBC people that I'd grown up with, the Peter Jones and Simon Jones in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and maybe people who were speaking in a certain way, and you'd start mimic them. It's like when you're playing music and you're singing and you start singing in an American accent, or you start singing like the person whose song you're playing. And one of the most arduous tasks is to work out how you speak when you narrate. And one way I found of doing this for me was that I started listening to recordings of myself talking to my best friends. So I'd phone up one of my best friends, either on Skype or on the phone, and I'd record myself. And I'd record myself and how I sounded when I was feeling at my most confident and free and loose. Not when I was trying to sit in a studio trying to prove myself that I was Simon Jones or Ira Glass, because then that produces that stilted speech where you're trying to be something that you think is good. So for me, it was about getting rid of the stylized accents and getting rid of sometimes it was performative American because I was in American. Sometimes it was performative English because I was English in America and I felt like I need to be a caricature. But that's a really important part of it, is finding out how you speak and writing down in your script how you speak so that when you're reading, it doesn't feel like you're reading. And there are some other very basic tips when you get into the recording studio. And the first one is a very obvious one, and it's breathe. When you're talking, there's a temptation to speak really, really quickly and to run on through sentences. And it's like driving a shopping trolley down a hill. You've got absolutely no control over that thing. There are no brakes and it's going quicker and quicker and quicker. And eventually you're going to hit a tree and you're going to stumble over yourself and it's going to be a disaster. So remember that you have more time to speak than you think. When you take a breath and you pause, that pause seems longer to you than it does to everyone around you. And the other thing that you might need to consider is that when I was living in London for a little bit before I went to America, I stayed with a friend for a week. And I did this thing called The Moth, which was a storytelling competition where you'd put together a 15-minute story about something that happened to you around a theme, and you'd perform it to an audience. I performed it to this audience at the Rich Mix Theatre. That's difficult to say. And I remember blundering around into it and immediately getting nervous, and immediately my mouth dried up like beef jerky, and I could barely enunciate anything. And one of the ways I tried to get around that was to drink lots of beer, which is not amazing. It doesn't help your comprehension either. But water, while it's great to be hydrated, doesn't always help as well. It doesn't normally solve the job, which is that your mouth is running out of saliva very, very quickly and dangerously if you're narrating. And a really good solution for this is one of these. So what a green apple will do, what eating a green apple will do, would be to encourage your mouth to develop the saliva as you digest this apple, and that'll help you to speak more fluidly, and it'll remove all the little ticky noises in your mouth as you're sort of like clicking around, and it will make you sound a lot more fluid and a lot less dried out. And so another thing that you should be thinking of really is softening your sound. Now, I'm in a room here with various little blankets and things like this, but if you're in a meeting room, there's that awful cavernous noise that echoes all over the place. And a really good way to get around that is to be recording underneath a blanket or in a cupboard full of coats or something like that, because you're then reflecting all of the audio around these soft surfaces, and it softens up the sound, and it makes it a lot easier for you to say what you need to say. So you've got your interviewees, you've got your scenes together, you've put together your story, and you feel like your script is absolutely amazing, and your narration has worked perfectly. So all you've got now is to put the icing on the cake on and add the sounds and the music, maybe that you mentioned in your scenes. And the anxious person at this point would start saying, oh, now I'm not entirely sure that my story is dramatic enough. What we'll need to do is we'll need to add some resonant and interesting sound effects and some climactic and cinematic sound, and it's going to bring up the emotion, and it's going to make it sound overwhelmingly tearful or exciting or exhilarating and wonderful and perfect storytelling. And the truth is that often, unless you tailor the sound effects and the music just right, music has the potential to do more damage to your story than it does good. Now, don't get me wrong, an extremely good piece of music or sound effect can absolutely elevate what you're doing, but you've got to be careful not to overuse it. And you've also got to remember that sometimes dropping from a noisy scene to complete silence with just a voice can be extremely evocative and compelling. But let's have a look at a few things around sound and music and what maybe you can add to your podcasts.
Okay, I'll tell you one story. I swim around the island. And one day I swam around the island. I came out at the beach at the end. And I started to walk back along the trail. And I saw this thrashing in the water. And it looked like a great big porpoise. So I went down to it. And obviously it was trying to beach itself, and there was a lot of blood in the water. And so I kind of sat with it.
Meet Jeff. He runs a record store out in Detroit.
I'm Jeff Bubeck from UHF Records.
I'm standing on the side of a rural road in Brazoria County, Texas. A side street branches off, but soon disappears under a few feet of water.
So basically what we've got here is a flooded neighborhood.
Dave Lochner surveys the scene. Back in Sacramento, he's a fire department captain, but when he's deployed to disasters, he's a water rescue specialist.
So I hope some of that's been useful to you. It's been a really interesting process to go through all the stages of creating a story from your first idea down to like putting your little sound effects on there. And even if you're isolating right now and you're inside, it can be a really interesting hobby to get into, an interesting new creative field to explore, whether you're doing that on your own with friends or doing that with as a family activity. And remember that every time we start something new, we put ourselves under pressure to be amazing at it. And we start thinking up reasons maybe why we shouldn't. And we start thinking, I bet other people are out there that are doing better than me. And the most important thing to hold on to is that nobody ever starts from the top. No one ever starts as a master of any craft. And the thing that you need to remember to do is to enjoy it if you're doing it, because you wouldn't do it if you didn't enjoy it. And to carry on finding that fun and excitement in everything that you do. So ignore what your anxiety is telling you right now. And remember, you're doing great.
So this is how it goes. Somebody spots a Pokemon nearby,
Just post up as an egg.
gets on Facebook,
It's gonna pop at 3:08.
calls around,
Hey, Mike!
and when they've got at least 4 or 5 players together, they enter the battle. They fight the Pokemon by tapping their phones. And if they win, they each get to add it to their collection, but only if they can catch it first.
Oh, you little sucker.
By collecting monsters, points, and items, they can level up. Barbara and Craig are 38 right now and